When we imagine the Wild West, we think of rugged cowboys, lawless towns, and daring outlaws. But have you ever wondered what life behind closed doors was like on the American frontier? From the rise of America's oldest profession to shocking gender roles and deadly birth control methods, intimacy in the Old West was stranger and more intriguing than fiction. In every dusty town, from Dodge City to Tombstone, the saloon wasn't the only place booming with business. Sex workers were everywhere, forming an essential part of frontier life, often becoming key community figures in settlements largely dominated by men. Known famously as America's oldest profession, these women provided not just physical comfort, but emotional companionship, conversation, and even entertainment in a harsh, lonely, and sometimes violent environment. Brothels varied significantly in their status and operations. Some establishments, like the elegant Birdcage Theater in Tombstone, Arizona, were lavish and highly respected, featuring luxurious decorations, fine dining, and live entertainment. Others, however, were grim, overcrowded, and impoverished hovels, reflecting the desperation of women striving to survive in tough frontier towns. The majority of sex workers were young, often teenagers or in their early 20s, with limited education and frequently coming from immigrant backgrounds. These women were usually escaping poverty, difficult family situations, or seeking independence in an era that severely restricted women's economic opportunities. Sadly, race and ethnicity played disturbing roles in the valuation of services. Women from marginalized groups typically faced exploitation and lower wages compared to their counterparts, vividly illustrating the deep-rooted inequalities that permeated frontier society. This stark social and economic divide painted a complex and often heartbreaking picture of life on the edge of civilization. Beyond brothels, the Wild West challenged traditional ideas about sexuality in fascinating ways. Contrary to the macho cowboy stereotype immortalized by Hollywood films, the realities of frontier life revealed a complex and fluid understanding of sexuality. Historian Peter Bogue highlights that without the rigid categorization of homosexual or heterosexual, intimate relationships between men were common, particularly in isolated mining and cattle camps where women were rare. These partnerships often arose naturally from necessity, companionship, and emotional comfort in harsh environments. In these predominantly male environments, gender roles also became highly adaptable. Some men took on domestic responsibilities like cooking, sewing, and cleaning, tasks traditionally assigned to women. These behaviors were generally accepted without judgment, as survival often depended on cooperation and resourcefulness. Historian Susan Lee Johnson's research on California's gold rush era illustrates how such flexible roles were part of everyday life, reflecting a pragmatic rather than ideological response to gender norms. This surprising tolerance underscores the unique social dynamics of frontier communities, where practicality often outweighed social expectations. But romance on the frontier had its darker side, especially for women. Condoms, typically made of animal intestines or vulcanized rubber, were available but extremely expensive and often reused, increasing the risk of infections. As a result, many women resorted to dangerously toxic remedies to prevent unwanted pregnancies. Commonly used substances included herbal concoctions derived from pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, which contained potent compounds capable of inducing miscarriage, but also causing severe illness, internal bleeding, and sometimes death. Pregnancy posed an existential threat, not just to women's livelihoods, but their very survival, especially for those working in frontier brothels, where pregnancy meant the end of income. Due to limited and inadequate medical care, childbirth itself carried enormous risks. Doctors, if available at all, were often poorly trained, and antiseptic practices were virtually non-existent until the late 19th century. Infections such as puerperal fever were rampant and frequently fatal. Historical records from towns like Leadville, Colorado, or Deadwood, South Dakota, indicate shockingly high maternal mortality rates. The heartbreaking choice women faced between dangerous abortive methods and the potentially deadly complications of childbirth underscores the grim realities of frontier medicine and women's health. Privacy during intimacy was practically non-existent in the cramped and modest living conditions typical of frontier homes. Families often inhabited single-room cabins constructed from logs, sod, or adobe bricks, sharing space not only among parents and children, but also extended family members, such as grandparents or unmarried siblings. Historical examples from settlers in Nebraska and Kansas describe cabins measuring just 12 feet by 12 feet, making discretion challenging to achieve. Beds were frequently rudimentary, constructed from straw-filled sacks or animal hides laid directly on the dirt floors. Such sleeping arrangements offered little opportunity for intimacy without being overheard or observed. To gain some sense of privacy, families sometimes utilized curtains, blankets, or quilts hung from the ceiling as makeshift partitions, but even these provided minimal separation. Diaries and memoirs from frontier settlers often describe the delicate balance of intimacy occurring discreetly after nightfall, emphasizing the quietness required in such shared spaces. Wealthier families, meanwhile, could afford separate bedrooms and homes with distinct living quarters, highlighting a significant socioeconomic gap. The lack of privacy was not merely a physical discomfort. It underscored the profound struggles frontier families faced in preserving personal dignity and intimate relationships amidst the challenging realities of daily survival. Cross-dressing emerged as an intriguing and surprisingly widespread phenomenon in the Wild West, challenging traditional gender roles more boldly than many realize today. Women regularly disguised themselves as men, often taking on masculine identities to seek greater opportunities, safety, and independence denied to them by a restrictive patriarchal society. Historical figures like Calamity Jane and Charlie Parkhurst are famous examples. Parkhurst lived as a man for over 30 years, becoming a renowned stagecoach driver and even voting decades before women's suffrage. Historian Peter Bogue's extensive research also uncovered numerous documented cases of men dressing as women, highlighting that cross-dressing was not merely practical, but also personal expression in an era surprisingly tolerant of unconventional identities. Accounts from frontier newspapers and legal records reveal men adopting female attire for reasons ranging from theatrical performances and social entertainment to deeply personal and identity-driven choices. This widespread practice provides a vivid glimpse into the complexities of frontier society, where rigid gender expectations coexisted alongside unexpected freedoms. These stories demonstrate that the Old West was not merely a place of strict social codes, but also a dynamic environment where individuals could explore and express their identities in ways often overlooked by traditional historical narratives. Yet, despite all this openness, certain practices remain taboo, even among cowboys and sex workers. Oral pleasure, for example, was largely viewed as exotic, distasteful, and associated with foreign cultures, making it unpopular among many Americans of the era. Historian Chad Heap, in his detailed exploration of sexuality in early American nightlife, points out that such acts were often stigmatized due to their perceived link with European decadence or Eastern customs, fostering suspicion and resistance among frontier settlers. Even within the otherwise liberal environment of frontier brothels, women who were rumored to engage in such acts could face social ostracism from peers or clientele. This resistance highlights a fascinating paradox within Wild West culture. A society that, while remarkably open in certain areas, drew strict boundaries in others, illuminating the complex interplay between acceptance and prejudice on the American frontier. Interestingly, Wild West slang for intimacy was as colorful and inventive as the people who used it. Terms such as pirooting, which humorously meant intercourse, provided insight into the playful yet crude nature of frontier culture. Other vivid expressions included rolling in the hay, referencing intimate moments occurring in barn lofts, and being horizontal, indicating a casual approach to intimacy. A popular term for brothels was sporting houses, while sex workers were often referred to as soiled doves, highlighting a mix of respect and scorn typical of frontier attitudes. Historical records from diaries and newspaper articles frequently employed these euphemisms, showcasing how slang served both as code and entertainment, subtly masking the blunt realities of frontier life. This unique lexicon illustrates the colorful, rough-and-tumble spirit that defined interpersonal relationships in an era where straightforward talk about intimacy was often considered improper or embarrassing. Unfortunately, The Wild West wasn't just a romanticized adventure. It was often perilously dangerous, especially for women. Assault was tragically commonplace, exacerbated by a society that viewed women as second-class citizens. Women's rights and legal protections lagged drastically behind technological advancements and social progress. Law enforcement was sparse, and in remote towns, justice systems were frequently corrupt or indifferent. Assault survivors often faced stigma and disbelief, leaving them with little or no recourse. Historical accounts from places like Dodge City and Tombstone document numerous instances where accusations against prominent community members were ignored or downplayed. Historian and women's crisis worker Nancy Williams emphasizes the sobering truth that while frontier life brought rapid technological innovations, from the telegraph to railroads, women's rights, safety, and societal standing saw minimal advancement. Organizations advocating for women's rights and protections, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, gradually emerged in response to these injustices, marking the slow and arduous beginning of women's advocacy in America. This stark disparity highlights not only the dangers frontier women faced daily, but also underscores how deeply entrenched patriarchal attitudes impeded meaningful change. Adding to the challenges, education about intimacy was virtually non-existent in the Wild West, leaving many settlers uninformed or dangerously misinformed about their own bodies and sexual health. The few available resources, known as marriage manuals, were often riddled with inaccuracies and driven by moralistic rather than scientific perspectives. Popular manuals of the late 1800s, such as The Marriage Guide by Dr. Frederick Hollick, primarily promoted procreation within marriage as the sole acceptable context for intimacy. These guides emphasized the moral dangers of self-pleasure, falsely claiming that it could cause physical ailments such as blindness, mental illness, or even infertility. This lack of reliable education left many individuals vulnerable to sexually transmitted infections, about which little was understood. Diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea spread rapidly due to ignorance and a lack of effective treatments, often resulting in serious health complications or even death. Settlers frequently relied on folk remedies, often ineffective or harmful, further highlighting the significant knowledge gap. Personal diaries and medical records from frontier towns detail heartbreaking accounts of individuals suffering severe and lasting consequences from untreated or misunderstood conditions. In the absence of formal education, most settlers gained their understanding through personal experiences, often at great physical and emotional cost. The lack of structured education not only perpetuated myths, but also intensified the stigma surrounding sexual health, forcing many to suffer silently. This harsh reality underscores how the frontier was not merely a place of physical hardship, but also one of considerable ignorance about fundamental aspects of human life. In the end, intimacy in the Wild West paints a complex and nuanced portrait, intricately blending freedom with constraint, openness with secrecy, and acceptance with repression. Beneath the romanticized myths of brave cowboys and daring outlaws lay genuine human stories of individuals who courageously navigated the turbulent landscape of frontier life. Men and women struggled daily with challenges of health, safety, social stigma, and rigid societal norms. Yet they also found unique ways to express their desires, identities, and emotions in unprecedented freedom. The true story of intimacy on the frontier reveals a world where resilience, creativity, and determination helped ordinary people survive and even thrive in a challenging, often unforgiving environment. What other surprising secrets lie hidden in history? Subscribe and find out in our next video.